title, He Will Not Go Back. Why Robert E. Lee realized Grant was unlike any general he'd ever faced. He was the most revered soldier in America, not just in the South, in America. In the spring of 1861, when he resigned his commission in the United States Army, Robert Edward Lee was offered command of the most powerful army in the Western Hemisphere. He turned it down. He turned down the Union Army because he could not, in his words, raise his hand against his own kin, his own state, his own home. For 3 years after that decision, he did what no one thought possible. He took an army of farmers, clerks, and school teachers, men who often went shoeless and hungry, and he humiliated the industrial might of the North. He made giants like McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, and Meade look like students in a classroom where he was the master. They came at him with superior numbers, superior logistics, and superior artillery, and he sent them back across the Rappahannock, the Rapidan, the Potomac bloodied, humiliated, and confused. By early 1864, Lee had become more than a general. He was a legend, an idea. The belief that one man, through sheer will and tactical brilliance, could defy arithmetic itself. The Confederacy believed in him with a faith that was almost religious. And why wouldn't they? Whenever a new federal general marched south, the question in Richmond was not if Lee would beat him, but how. They expected the same script. The Union would send another general. Lee would outmaneuver him. The war would continue. But in March of 1864, a man arrived in Washington, D.C. who had not read that script. He was short, stooped, and unkempt. He had been working in a leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, just 4 years earlier. He was a West Point graduate, yes, but one who had been drummed out of the Army for drinking. He was a failed farmer, a failed real estate agent, a failed clerk. His name was Ulysses S. Grant, and he had one quality that Robert E. Lee had never faced in an adversary. He would not go back. This is the story of how, in the spring of 1864, the legend of Robert E. Lee collided with the reality of Ulysses S. Grant. It is a story not of grand cavalry charges or Napoleonic maneuvers, but of two minds. One, the polished aristocratic master of the tactical chessboard. The other, a quiet, determined bulldog who realized that in a war of attrition, the bigger dog always wins. This is the story of the Overland Campaign, and the moment Robert E. Lee realized that his greatest weapon, the psychology of his enemy, had finally been rendered useless. To understand the shock of what happened in May 1864, you have to understand the pattern. The pattern was everything. It was the very air Robert E. Lee breathed. For 3 years, the Army of Northern Virginia had been the hunter, and the Army of the Potomac had been the prey, but with a strange dynamic. The hunter was outnumbered. The prey was terrified. Let's look at the record. In 1862, George B. McClellan, the young Napoleon, brought a massive army to the gates of Richmond. Lee took command, launched a series of aggressive attacks in the 7 days battles, and though he lost more men than McClellan, he inflicted a psychological wound. McClellan became convinced he was outnumbered. He retreated. He went back to Washington. Then came John Pope. Lee split his army in half, a cardinal sin in military theory, and sent Stonewall Jackson to crush Pope's supply lines. At Second Manassas, Pope was caught between two wings of Lee's army. Pope retreated. He went back to Washington. Then came Ambrose Burnside. At Fredericksburg, Burnside marched his men across an open plain into a wall of Confederate musketry on Marye's Heights. It was a slaughter. Burnside retreated. He went back to Washington. Then came Joseph Hooker. Fighting Joe had the most brilliant plan of any Union general. He outflanked Lee, got behind him, and had him in a trap. But at Chancellorsville, Lee did the unthinkable again. He divided his army in the face of a superior force. He sent Stonewall Jackson on a 12-mile march around Hooker's flank. The attack shattered Hooker's corps. Hooker, stunned by a cannonball that struck the porch pillar he was leaning against, lost his nerve. He retreated. He went back across the Rappahannock. Finally, there was George Meade. After Gettysburg, Meade pursued Lee to the Potomac River. Lee was trapped. The river was high. He had no pontoon bridge. Meade had a victorious army, but Meade was cautious. He held a council of war. He hesitated. Lee built a pontoon bridge, and he retreated. He went back to Virginia. Do you see it? Every single time. It's not just that they lost. It's that they went back. They retreated to their supply bases. They retreated to Washington. They gave Lee time to rest, to resupply, to strengthen his defenses, and to choose the next ground on which to fight. Lee understood this. He understood the psychology of his enemy. He knew that the Union generals were terrified of losing their armies. They fought to avoid defeat. Lee fought to win. And when they retreated, he called it a victory. By the winter of 1863 to 1864, this pattern was not just a military reality, it was a psychological fortress. The Army of the Potomac was said to have a graveyard of generals. The men in blue had been beaten so many times that they had come to believe, at some level, that Lee was invincible. His name alone was a weapon. And then came Grant. When Ulysses S. Grant was appointed lieutenant general and given command of all Union armies, he did not come to Washington to give a grand speech. He came to a city he had never visited as a commander. He checked into Willard's Hotel. A clerk recognized him, the muddy, cigar-smoking man in the dusty private's uniform with the tarnished shoulder straps. The clerk gave him a room. The next day, he met President Lincoln. Lincoln had been searching for 3 years for a general who understood something that seemed so simple. Lincoln had said it himself. Our success in the war depends upon a general who will take a united army into the field and fight it and keep fighting until the enemy is destroyed. Not outmaneuvered, not driven back, destroyed. Grant had proven he understood this in the West. At Fort Donelson, when the Confederate commander asked for terms of surrender, Grant's reply was brutal. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. The newspapers called him Unconditional Surrender Grant. At Vicksburg, he had done the impossible. He had marched his army down the west bank of the Mississippi, crossed below the city, abandoned his supply lines, and lived off the land. He had laid siege to Vicksburg for 47 days until it starved. He did not go back. But Virginia was not Mississippi. The Army of Northern Virginia was not the Confederate garrison at Vicksburg. This was Robert E. Lee, the finest army ever assembled on the continent. The critics in Washington whispered, Grant was a butcher. He only won because he had numbers. He would be eaten alive by Lee. Grant listened to none of it. He attached his headquarters to the Army of the Potomac. He did not intend to command from a desk in Washington. He would ride with the men, and in March of 1864, he laid out his plan. It was stunning in its simplicity. There would be no more turning back, no more flanking marches that ended in retreat. He would go directly at Lee, not at Richmond, at Lee. He would use his superior numbers to press the Confederate army constantly, relentlessly. If Lee retreated to a defensive position, Grant would flank him, forcing him out. If Lee attacked, Grant would absorb the blow and counterattack. He would not maneuver for territory. He would maneuver to destroy an army. His orders to General Meade, who would remain in tactical command of the Army of the Potomac, were clear. The campaign was set to begin on May 4, 1864. The objective was not Richmond. The objective was Lee. On the night of May 3rd, 1864, the Army of the Potomac began to move. It was a host of over 118,000 men. They crossed the Rapidan River at 3 separate fords, marching into a dense, tangled forest known as the Wilderness. It was the same desolate landscape where Hooker had been shattered a year earlier. The locals called it a howling wilderness. It was a place where the forest was so thick that cavalry was useless. Artillery was nearly impossible to deploy, and visibility was limited to a few yards. Lee knew the wilderness. He knew its power to neutralize the Union's advantage in numbers and artillery. He knew that in that labyrinth of second-growth timber and tangled underbrush, a smaller, more aggressive force could fight on equal terms. He moved his army, roughly 66,000 men, to intercept Grant. He meant to do what he had done to Hooker. He meant to strike first, strike hard, and send this new Union general reeling back across the river. On the morning of May 5th, the two armies collided. It was not a battle, it was a firestorm. Men fought from tree to tree in thickets so dense they could not see the enemy 10 feet away. The underbrush caught fire from the musket blasts, and wounded men from both sides burned to death where they lay. It was chaos. It was hell. Lee, as he always did, took the initiative. He threw his corps commanders, Longstreet, Hill, Ewell, into the fight with furious, disjointed attacks. The Union line was bent but did not break. On the second day, May 6th, James Longstreet, Lee's old warhorse, launched a devastating flank attack that rolled up the Union left flank. It looked like Chancellorsville all over again. The Union Army was on the verge of collapse. And then something happened that had never happened before. The Union Army did not retreat. It held. A brigade of Vermont troops, against all odds, counterattacked and blunted Longstreet's momentum. Longstreet himself was shot by his own men, a grievous wound that removed Lee's most trusted subordinate from the field. But even with Longstreet gone, the Confederate attacks could not break the Union line. As darkness fell on May 6th, the Wilderness was a smoking, burning graveyard. The two armies had fought to a stalemate. Casualties were staggering. The Union had lost over 17,000 men. Lee had lost over 11,000. Proportionally, it was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Now came the moment that would define the rest of the war. The Army of the Potomac was bloodied. It was shocked. The men had fought in the inferno. Their officers looked to the south, expecting to see the familiar side of the army packing up to retreat across the fords, to go back to Fredericksburg or Washington to lick their wounds. They had done it after Fredericksburg. They had done it after Chancellorsville. They had done it after every battle. Lee watched from his headquarters. He expected it. He had built his entire military philosophy on that expectation. He waited for the signs of a retreating army. He waited for the ambulances to start moving north. He waited for the dust clouds of a column in retrograde. But the dust clouds never came. On the morning of May 7th, Robert E. Lee received the reports from his scouts. He must have read them with a mixture of disbelief and a dawning, cold realization. The Union Army was not retreating. They were not going back. They were moving, but not north. They were moving south to the left, toward a crossroads called Spotsylvania Courthouse. Grant was not retreating. He was flanking. He was pulling his army out of the Wilderness and marching around Lee's exposed right flank, placing himself between Lee and Richmond. This was the move that Hooker had attempted but failed to follow through on. Grant was doing it after 2 days of the most brutal combat the Army of the Potomac had ever endured. The historian Shelby Foote once described the moment this news reached the Confederate lines. He said that when the men of the Army of Northern Virginia realized that the Union Army was not retreating, but was instead moving south, they understood. They understood that the old pattern was broken. They understood that they were in a new kind of war. One man, a Confederate soldier, was quoted as saying, "We knew then that we were going to have a fight." But the moment of realization for Robert E. Lee was likely more profound. He had staked everything on the psychology of his enemy. He had spent 3 years cultivating a mystique of invincibility so potent that it froze Union generals in their tracks. He had counted on that mystique, and now, in a single morning, it had been shattered. He was facing a man who did not care about the legend. He did not care about the past. He did not care about the casualties. He cared about one thing: moving forward. Grant himself, in his memoirs, would later describe his mindset that night. While his army was preparing to march, he sat on a log, alone in the darkness. He later wrote that he felt no great anxiety about the next day. He said he knew that the only way to defeat Lee was to keep constantly pressing him. He wrote, "I had already made up my mind that I would not recross the Rapidan until the campaign was closed." Think about the gravity of that sentence. I would not recross the Rapidan until the campaign was closed. In other words, I am not going back, ever. Not after a battle, not after 1,000 battles. This ends here, with one army destroyed. Lee now had to face a reality he had never faced before. He had to fight a general who would not retreat. That meant that every battle from this point forward was not a tactical engagement to be won or lost. It was a step in a long, grinding process of mutual annihilation. And in that kind of fight, Lee could not win. Lee had now been in constant combat for nearly 2 weeks. His army, which had started the campaign at 66,000, was down to less than 40,000 effective soldiers. He had inflicted 40,000 casualties on the Union Army, a horrific number. But Grant had replacements coming. He had a pipeline. Lee did not. Every man Lee lost was gone forever. In the end, Robert E. Lee's realization was a tragic one. He realized that his art, the art of generalship that had made him a legend, was obsolete. He had met a man who would not play the game by the old rules. A man who would not go back. 1 year later, almost to the day, Grant's relentless pressure finally snapped the Confederate lines at Petersburg. Lee evacuated Richmond and attempted to march his starving army to a railroad junction in North Carolina, hoping to join up with another Confederate force. Grant pursued. He did not let him go. He sent his cavalry under Philip Sheridan to block the roads ahead of Lee. On April 9, 1865, Palm Sunday, Robert E. Lee, dressed in a new full-dress uniform, rode into the village of Appomattox Courthouse. He was wearing his finest sash and his ceremonial sword, a commander surrendering with the dignity of a fallen prince. Across a small table in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house, he met Ulysses S. Grant. Grant arrived late. He was wearing a mud-stained private's uniform. His trousers were tucked into muddy boots. His shoulder straps were tarnished. He had a bad headache. They spoke briefly of the old army. Lee mentioned he had not seen Grant since the Mexican War. Grant said, "I remember you well, General." They then turned to the terms. Lee expected harsh terms, prison perhaps. Grant wrote them out. The officers and men would be paroled. They would not be tried for treason. They would return to their homes. They would keep their horses and mules for the spring planting. And then, in a moment that has echoed through history, Lee asked if his cavalrymen and artillerymen might also keep their horses. They were needed for the farms. Grant looked at the man who had eluded him, outmaneuvered him and cost him 50,000 casualties in a single month. And he said, yes, he would not go back, but he would let them go home. The war was over. The man who would not retreat had met the man who would not go back. And in the quiet of that parlor, a new kind of peace began.